Microsoft might be bleeding Windows customers faster than any of us imagined.
Microsoft didn't lose users because Apple got better. They're losing users because Windows got worse. And today, I'm going to show you the exact chain reaction that pushed millions of people away from Windows. Not slowly, not accidentally, but predictably. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this shift started, why it's accelerating, and why it's much bigger than Linux itself. So if Windows has felt more annoying every year, you didn't imagine it. You clicked the right video. This is not a nerd debate. This decides what software you're forced to use, how often you must upgrade hardware, and who actually controls your computer. Most people think operating systems don't matter anymore. They're wrong, because when one platform dominates, it decides the rules for everyone else. And right now, those rules are changing. In a moment, I'll show you the number that proves it. But first, you need to understand the stakes. December 2025. Linux desktop market share reaches 11.4% worldwide. Now, at first glance, that number doesn't sound insane. 11% doesn't feel like a takeover. It doesn't sound like a revolution. And that's exactly why most people ignore it. But here's the thing, numbers don't matter by themselves. Trends do. 3 years earlier, Linux was at 3.1%. That means this didn't grow slowly, it didn't grow naturally, it jumped. And when something jumps like that, it usually means something broke somewhere else. Let me put it in very simple terms. When people choose something new, growth is slow. When people are escaping something old, growth is fast. This is fast growth, which means this isn't Linux suddenly becoming cool. This is something pushing people out of Windows. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. This growth didn't come from people buying their first computer. It didn't come from kids choosing Linux over Windows. It came from people who already had a system, already knew Windows, and decided to leave it behind. That's important, because leaving is harder than choosing. Switching operating systems means learning something new, risking mistakes, breaking habits. People don't do that unless the pain of staying becomes bigger than the fear of switching. So when you see a jump like this, the real question isn't, why is Linux growing? The real question is, what became so painful that millions of people finally said, I'd rather relearn everything than keep using this? And in a second, I'll show you exactly who those people are. But before we get there, remember what we said earlier. This isn't about Linux being perfect. This is about something changing on the Windows side. And once you see where this growth actually comes from, the entire story flips. A large survey asked new Linux users one very simple question. Not a technical question, not a political question, just this. What operating system did you use before Linux? Now, before I tell you the answer, stop for a second and think about it. Most people assume the answer is obvious. They think, probably Mac users experimenting. Maybe students. Maybe people who always liked Linux. That assumption feels logical, but it's completely wrong, because when the results came back, they shocked even Linux supporters. 87% answered Windows, not Mac, not Chrome OS, Windows. Let that sink in for a moment. This means Linux isn't attracting outsiders. It's absorbing insiders. People who already knew Windows. People who already had their workflows. People who already had years of habits built inside Microsoft's ecosystem. Those people don't leave easily. In fact, most people will tolerate a bad experience for years before they finally walk away. So when 87% of new users come from the same place, it tells us something very important. This wasn't curiosity. This was exhaustion. These users didn't switch because Linux sounded exciting. They switched because Windows stopped feeling tolerable. And that distinction matters. Because when people leave out of curiosity, they come back. But when people leave out of exhaustion, they don't. This is why calling them Windows refugees isn't exaggeration. Refugees don't leave because they want adventure. They leave because staying becomes worse than leaving. And here's the key insight that connects everything we talked about earlier. Remember the number from the last chapter, the jump from 3.1% to 11.4%. Now you know who caused that jump. Not new users, not hype, not trends. Longtime Windows users finally saying, "I'm done." But here's where it gets even more interesting. If Windows users are leaving, why aren't they going to Mac? Mac is polished. Mac is popular. Mac is heavily advertised. So why didn't they go there? That answer reveals the real problem with Windows today. And once you see it, you'll understand why this migration didn't stop and why it's actually accelerating. People didn't leave Windows because of one big mistake. That's important. If it had been one big failure, Microsoft could have fixed it. People left because of many small things stacked on top of each other every single day. Let me explain it in a very simple way. Using Windows today feels like this. You sit down at your computer to do your work, and your computer keeps interrupting you with things it wants. You pay for Windows and still see ads. Ads in the Start menu. Ads in Settings. Ads inside File Explorer. Not loud ads, not obvious ads, quiet ads, constant ads. And that's actually worse, because they don't shock you, they wear you down. Then there are the updates that don't ask, they tell. Restart required. Update scheduled. It doesn't matter if you're busy, it doesn't matter if you're in the middle of something important. Your computer decides, and then came accounts. Sign in to continue. Connect your Microsoft account. Sync your data. Each step feels small, almost harmless, but together, they change something fundamental. Your computer stops feeling like a tool. It starts feeling like a service. And here's the key idea most people don't realize yet. People don't leave platforms because they're bad. They leave because they feel disrespected. Windows 10 still felt like your computer. Windows 11 feels like Microsoft's computer that you're allowed to use, and that emotional shift matters more than any technical problem. Now remember what we asked at the end of the last chapter? If people were leaving Windows, why didn't they go to Mac? Mac is polished. Mac is popular. Mac is everywhere. Here's the answer, because switching to Mac doesn't solve the core problem. It changes the logo, it doesn't change the relationship. Mac still locks you into one company, one ecosystem, one way of doing things. Linux, on the other hand, offers something different. Not perfection, not magic, but control. And once people start looking for control, they don't compare features anymore. They compare freedom. But frustration alone still doesn't explain why so many people actually took action. Because being annoyed is one thing. Taking the risk to switch is another. Something had to prove that leaving Windows was actually possible. And that proof didn't come from offices or tech reviewers. It came from somewhere far more convincing. The trigger didn't come from offices or governments or tech forums. It came from gamers. In 2022, Valve released the Steam Deck, a handheld PC running Linux. Millions bought it without thinking about the OS, they just wanted to play games. Then something surprising happened. The games worked. Games people assumed required Windows ran perfectly fine. And that planted a dangerous thought. If Linux can do this here, what else can it do? Soon, gamers started testing. Same PC, same game. Windows 11, 285 frames per second, to Linux, 340 frames per second. Why? Because Linux doesn't run layers of background services you didn't ask for. Less background noise means more power for what matters. That result spread fast. Hundreds of thousands of views. Thousands of comments saying, "Installing Linux tonight." Once gamers switch, they don't switch quietly. Steam's own data confirms it. Linux gaming usage 1.4% in 2023, 3.2% in 2024-6, 0.8% in early 2025, 9.3% by the end of 2025. Nearly 1 in 10 Steam users now runs Linux. That's over 13 million gamers no longer dependent on Windows, and that matters because gamers are usually the first to notice when something works. But gaming alone didn't remove the biggest barrier. For years, Linux failed for one reason: fear. It looked complicated. It sounded technical. It felt risky. 5 years ago, switching required command lines, troubleshooting, patience. Now, you need a YouTube video, millions of views on tutorials titled "Switching from Windows to Linux in 2025." Comments full of people saying that was easier than installing Windows. Knowledge used to protect Windows. Now, free education destroyed that protection. Individuals experiment, cities calculate, and cities are switching. Munich, Barcelona, Paris, tens of thousands of computers migrating to Linux. Not for ideology, for cost, for stability, for privacy. One telecom company saved tens of millions by avoiding Windows 11 hardware upgrades. When governments move, corporations pay attention. This only works because Linux changed. Modern Linux installs faster than Windows, works out of the box, doesn't spy on you, doesn't show ads. Ubuntu feels mainstream. Pop. iOS feels familiar. Linux Mint feels like the Windows people miss. Linux stopped asking users to adapt. It adapted to users. Most apps today live in the browser. Email, docs, meetings. They don't care what OS you use. Creative work, DaVinci Resolve, Blender Inkscape. And for that one Windows-only app, you virtualize it. Linux for 95% of your life, Windows only when absolutely necessary. The wall is gone. People just hadn't noticed yet. Here's where this leads. At around 18% market share, something irreversible happens. Developers must support Linux. Hardware gets optimized for Linux. Network effects flip. Linux stops being the alternative. Windows becomes the alternative. And projections say we're approaching that point fast. Up to this point, you might be thinking something like this. Okay, I understand why people try Linux, but here's the real question. Why do they stay? Because trying something new is easy. Going back is even easier. So if millions of people aren't returning to Windows, there has to be something deeper happening. And it's not performance, it's not price, it's not ideology, it's something much simpler. Control. Let me explain this in the easiest way possible. On Windows, your computer feels busy. Even when you're doing nothing, something is happening in the background. Syncing, checking, updating, recommending. It feels noisy. On Linux, the computer feels quiet. Not empty, not limited, just calm. You click something, and it opens. You close something, and it's gone. Nothing pops up asking you to sign in. Nothing suggests a subscription. Nothing tries to help you by selling you something. And that feeling is powerful. Because for the first time in years, your computer feels like a tool again. Not a platform. Not a product. Not a billboard. A tool. And here's something almost nobody talks about. When people switch to Linux, they start learning how their computer actually works. Not because they have to, but because they're allowed to. Menus make sense. Settings are transparent. Nothing is hidden behind marketing decisions. One new Linux user said something that perfectly explains this. I learned more about my computer in 2 weeks on Linux than in 20 years on Windows. And once that clicks, going back feels strange. Not because Windows is unusable, but because it feels restrictive. Like using a locked phone after owning one you can fully control. Now connect this back to what we said earlier. People didn't leave Windows because Linux is perfect. They left because Windows stopped respecting them. And once people experience an operating system that doesn't fight them, doesn't interrupt them, doesn't talk down to them, they don't want to give that up. This is why the migration doesn't reverse. This is why the numbers don't flatten. And this is why the next phase is so important. Because when enough people reach this point, the question stops being, should I switch? And becomes, why would I ever go back? And that leads directly to what happens next. When this mindset spreads beyond individuals and becomes the default expectation. If this video helped you understand what's really happening, hit like. It helps this reach people who feel the frustration but can't explain it yet. And if you want to know which Linux version fits you best based on how you actually use your computer, that's the next video. Microsoft isn't advertising the shift, but it's happening anyway. Quietly, relentlessly. And now, you know why.